I woke up to the sound of my door's autolock clicking shut, the same thing that happens every night when I hit the sleep setting on the system. But something felt different this time. My room was quieter, unnervingly so. I glanced at the clock on my wall, 6:30 a.m., a normal time for me to wake up. But the silence was off. I shot up, immediately sensing that something had gone wrong. That's when I noticed the dark shape near the window. My alien roommate, Zorvith, was standing motionless by the wall. He wasn't staring out at the view of the colony's artificial horizon like he usually did, his three eyes fixed on the panorama. No, this time he was frozen. And then, without warning, he spun around, locking eyes with me. He looked different. For one, his bioluminescent markings, usually glowing in a calm blue hue, were pulsing erratically, flashing in rapid patterns. His skin, usually a smooth, reflective chrome, had an almost sickly tinge to it. He wasn't supposed to be awake this early. In fact, he hadn't moved from his corner of the apartment for days, settling into his usual reclusive state. Zorvith was a quiet, introverted alien from the planet Zotari. He was part of an intergalactic research program that brought aliens into human societies for social experiments. When I first signed up for the housing program, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It was supposed to be a normal exchange program. I'd let a researcher, an alien in this case, live with me for a year in exchange for a modest stipend. It was supposed to be simple, no big deal. Humans and aliens cohabiting, sharing resources, learning from one another. But I had no idea that a single detail about Zorvith's biology was going to shatter everything I thought I knew about interspecies living. Zorvith's species had what you could call an intriguing mating season. It was an event where their instincts took over and they needed to find a mate, but the problem was, no one had ever explained what that actually entailed. At least not to me. Of course, I read all the pamphlets. Well, I skimmed them, but no one mentioned the effect it had on his physiology. I had just assumed he'd be quieter than usual, a bit more reclusive, but nothing more. But now, standing in my bedroom as I tried to process what was happening, it became clear that the mating season wasn't just a physiological shift. It was a full-blown crisis. Zorvith's glowing marks were no longer subtle. They were flashing so rapidly now that it looked like an emergency alert system. His body was trembling, his stance rigid. He turned his head toward me with a sudden sharpness, his mandibles clicking audibly. "Do not leave," he rasped, his voice deeper than usual, a throaty growl that made the hairs on my neck stand up. "Wah?" I stuttered, confused. "Lockdown, process, initiated," Zorvith muttered. His body seemed to flicker with an odd, jagged rhythm, almost like he was glitching in and out of his natural form. "You are required." My heart raced as a chill crept down my spine. The words lockdown and required had my attention. Zorvith's eyes locked onto mine with a frightening intensity, his upper limbs twitching as though struggling to control the alien impulses that overtook him. His body was shaking now, uncontrollably. Before I could speak, the door to the apartment slammed shut with a loud, reverberating clang. It wasn't the usual soft hiss of the automated airlocks. No, this was something heavier. Something wrong. I moved toward the door instinctively, my hand reaching for the handle, but it didn't budge. I tugged again, nothing. It wasn't locked in the way I was familiar with. This was different. The whole system felt wrong, like it had been overridden. Panic flooded my chest. I pressed the intercom, trying to reach the building's security. "Hello?" I called into the mic, my voice shaking. "I'm locked in my apartment. Can someone?" The static buzzed through, a few moments of silence, and then a mechanical, robotic voice interrupted. "Attention, lockdown procedure in effect. Please remain inside. Do not attempt to leave the premises. All external communications are disabled during this period." My pulse pounded in my ears. Lockdown procedure? I had never heard of anything like this. I didn't know whether to scream or try to make sense of it. But before I could process more, I turned back to Zorvith. His posture had changed entirely, his body was no longer trembling. Instead, his entire frame was coiled like a spring. His eyes locked onto me with a terrifying certainty. "You will stay," he said again, his voice now a low rumble that vibrated through my chest. His posture shifted, and suddenly his body was all tension, muscles bracing for something I couldn't understand. There was something undeniably primal in the air now. I had never seen Zorvith like this. It was as if an entirely different entity had replaced the quiet, reserved researcher I had known. "What's going on, Zorvith?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, knowing that it wasn't likely I was going to get a reasonable answer. But he didn't respond. Instead, he began pacing, the floor beneath his feet echoing with the weight of his movements. I could feel the change in the room. The atmosphere thickened. It was as if the entire apartment had become a pressure chamber, and every second was another breath drawing in deeper, heavier, until it felt suffocating. The lights in the room flickered, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make the situation feel even more urgent. Zorvith, what? His head snapped in my direction, and before I could finish, a sharp, almost guttural cry erupted from him. It wasn't a scream, it was more of a roar, an unearthly sound that vibrated deep within my bones. And then, the reality of what was happening started to sink in. Zorvith wasn't just having a bad day. He wasn't simply off his routine. He was in the throes of an overwhelming instinctual shift. His species wasn't like mine. The mating season wasn't something that could be easily ignored. It was not just about finding a mate. It was about survival. And right now, in the midst of the lockdown, I was the only other being available. A horrified realization dawned on me. In his culture, he didn't choose a mate the way humans did. His species didn't even ask. It was a biological imperative. A demand, an overwhelming force that couldn't be controlled, only endured. And I was going to have to survive this. Zorvith, I don't understand, I whispered, panic now creeping into my voice. But my words fell on deaf ears. He was no longer listening. He was consumed, lost in the primal drive of his species' needs. The room had become a battleground, and I had no idea how I was going to make it out of this alive. I stumbled back from Zorvith, heart hammering in my chest. I had to find a way out of this, but the room was closing in on me. My thoughts were scattered, spinning in a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and the undeniable sense that something deeply unnatural was unfolding around me. Zorvith had stopped his pacing, his body now rigid with an energy I didn't know how to describe. His 3 eyes were locked on me, each one scanning me like an animal eyeing its prey. The air between us was charged with something palpable, something I couldn't name, but I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, filling my lungs with an almost electric tension. The feeling was suffocating. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing, but my movements were sluggish, as if the room itself was pushing back against me, as if Zorvith's presence was altering the very air around us. His skin shimmered unnaturally under the harsh lights of the apartment, his bioluminescent markings flashing faster now, an erratic pulse that sent shivers down my spine. This wasn't just about him being off. This was something far beyond the scope of anything I had signed up for when I agreed to house an alien. This was no longer the quiet, reserved researcher I'd been living with. This was something raw, something primal. Something that wasn't human. Zorvith, I said again, my voice breaking. You have to calm down. Please tell me what's going on. He didn't respond. Instead, a deep, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. His lower limbs twitched and his fingers extended, long talon-like claws unfurling as if they were preparing for some sort of attack. Every movement was sharp, deliberate, like the sudden burst of energy before a storm hits. In that moment I realized I was trapped. There was nowhere to run. The apartment had been locked down, and from the looks of it there was no way out, not unless Zorvith allowed it. But he wasn't going to allow anything. Not right now. Not with the mating season raging inside him like a wildfire. I cast around the room, eyes scanning for anything that might give me an edge. But there was nothing. The walls were smooth, featureless, and the furniture sparse. I had little to defend myself with, and the sudden, violent changes in Zorvith's demeanor made it clear that reasoning with him was out of the question. His biological instincts were now fully in control. Zorvith, I tried again, voice trembling, what do you need? We can work this out. Just calm down, all right? His response was a low, throaty hiss, the sound reverberating through the room with an unsettling intensity. He was no longer looking at me with recognition. He wasn't Zorvith anymore. He was something else, something I couldn't begin to comprehend. He took a step forward and I flinched, my back pressing against the smooth wall behind me. My throat tightened. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick with tension, and the growing sense of danger was suffocating. Zorvith's eyes glowed brighter now, like the burning embers of a fire, and the rapid pulses of his bioluminescence were like a warning. Each flash was a signal, a cry from his biology, from his very being, and I had no idea how to respond. Please, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm not, whatever it is you need, I'm not the right. Zorvith's body stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he moved closer. His mandibles clicked with a strange rhythm, a soft, rhythmic click that was somehow unnerving. As he neared me, the overwhelming presence of his being seemed to fill the room, pushing me back. He was huge, towering over me, his form impossibly tall and angular, his 3 eyes gleaming with an unearthly hunger. And then, without warning, he reached out. His long fingers stretched toward me, each movement deliberate, but unfeeling, as though driven by a force beyond his control. I swatted his hand away instinctively, my heart pounding in panic. "No. Stop," I shouted, but the words were hollow, empty in the face of the primal force that gripped Zorvith. The shock of my resistance seemed to have a strange effect. His movements slowed, but not in a way I understood. It wasn't like a human being pulling back after realizing their mistake. No, it was something else. Something more dangerous. Zorvith's head tilted slightly to the side, his 3 eyes narrowing as if processing something. A strange sound emanated from him, not quite a growl, not quite a hum, but a resonant noise that seemed to vibrate through the very air around us. I felt it deep in my chest, a dull ache like my body was being tuned to his frequency. His voice came next, rough and guttural. "Resist," he said. "Mating is not a choice." The words sent a chill down my spine. I could feel his presence surrounding me, his alien physiology more foreign and unsettling than ever before. His species wasn't like mine. There were no social norms, no concepts of consent, no understanding of boundaries like humans had. His biological instincts ruled everything. And right now I was caught in the wake of that force. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to handle this. I thought back to the pamphlets I had skimmed before signing up for the exchange program. There was a line about how during mating season, Zotarians could become highly territorial and aggressive. But nothing had prepared me for the reality of it. Nothing had prepared me for this. In the chaos of my racing thoughts, a sudden realization struck me. If I didn't do something, now, I might not survive this encounter. But what could I do? What could I possibly do to stop an alien species' mating instincts from taking over? I looked back at Zorvith, his eyes locked on me with a predatory focus, and for the first time since I'd met him, I realized I had no control over the situation. I was powerless. Zorvith let out another deep growl, his eyes flashing dangerously, and I knew with cold certainty that I had to make a decision. He was getting closer, his body tense with anticipation. I had moments, maybe moments, before he fully lost himself to his biological demands. But what would happen if I couldn't stop him? Would he hurt me? Or worse? Before I could gather my thoughts, his hand reached for me again, and this time, there was no hesitation. My breath hitched as Zorvith's taloned fingers reached out for me, his movements sharp and unrelenting. My heart raced faster, pumping adrenaline into my veins as I felt the weight of the situation bear down on me. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls narrowing like a cage, and Zorvith, my once docile alien roommate, was the predator and I the prey. His biological instincts were driving him, but somewhere deep in the abyss of my mind, I refused to believe this was how it had to end. The sharp click of his mandibles echoed, a low rhythmic sound that made my skin crawl. His 3 eyes, glowing with an unnatural intensity, locked onto mine with a focused hunger that filled me with dread. I knew this wasn't the same being I'd been living with for the past few months. The quiet, reserved researcher had vanished, replaced by an animal, a creature enslaved by its own biology, incapable of rational thought or restraint. He took another step toward me, his long muscular limbs moving fluidly, almost predatory in their grace. My mind raced as I tried to think of anything that could get me out of this. The intercom was down, the door locked. There was no escape. The only option was to stand my ground, even though my instincts screamed at me to run. But I couldn't outrun him. Not now. Not in this apartment. Not when he was so much faster, so much stronger. I swallowed, my throat dry, and for a split second I considered begging. I considered pleading with him to remember who he was. But as his hand came closer, I realized that wasn't going to work. His mind wasn't his own anymore. It was ruled by something far more primal. I wasn't going to talk my way out of this. I had to do something. The panic surged inside me, but beneath it, a flicker of resolve began to take root. If I couldn't escape, I would have to face him. I needed to buy myself time to think, time to act. My eyes darted to the desk in the corner of the room, the only piece of furniture I could reach. My mind screamed at me to use anything at my disposal to survive. There were a few tools on the desk. Nothing weaponized, but maybe I could make something work. Zorvith's next step toward me brought him within arm's reach. His long fingers curled toward me, and I knew it was now or never. "Zorvith," I shouted, my voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the thick air between us. "Listen to me. You're not, this isn't you." His head jerked toward me, his eyes narrowing. He didn't speak, but the way his body shifted told me he was listening, if only for a brief moment. A flicker of recognition? Or was it a fleeting hesitation, a sliver of the Zorvith I once knew still lingering beneath the surface? I seized the opportunity, my fingers flying toward the desk. I snatched up the small metal rod from the top, a stray piece of equipment I'd once seen him use for calibration experiments. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. With a burst of desperation, I swung it toward him, aiming for his chest. The metal rod clanged harmlessly against his reflective skin, and Zorvith flinched, but only for a moment. Then his eyes flashed dangerously. He let out a low, rumbling growl, and before I could react, his hand shot forward, grabbing my wrist with terrifying strength. I gasped, my fingers slipping on the metal rod as I tried to break free. But his grip was like iron, unyielding, and my body was no match for his. I struggled against him, panic rising in my chest as he pulled me closer, his body towering over mine. His hot breath brushed against my neck, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate under the weight of his presence. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of pulling me into him, Zorvith hesitated, his claws hovering dangerously close to my skin. His body trembled, and I felt the tension in his grip loosen slightly, though his strength still held me captive. Zorvith's voice broke through the growl, rough and strained, I cannot control it. His words sent a jolt of recognition through me. This wasn't some evil alien trying to hurt me. This was an animal, caught in the grip of a biological imperative that wasn't his fault. He wasn't in his right mind. He didn't want this. I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of conflict beneath the rage. Zorvith, I said softly, my voice trembling. You can fight it. You have to fight it. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flash of understanding in his eyes. He opened his mouth, his mandibles twitching, and then he pulled back. I couldn't believe it. He was actually listening. But the reprieve was short-lived. His body shuddered, and the pulsing lights on his skin flared brighter, almost blinding me. His breathing became erratic, shallow, and labored. The biological urge was too strong. It was too much for him to resist. Not enough, Zorvith muttered, his voice filled with desperation. Mate. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The word sent a wave of horror through me, and I immediately knew what he meant. His instincts had overridden everything else. The urge to mate, to reproduce, was all-consuming. And I was the only one here. In that moment, I realized I was no longer facing Zorvith, the researcher, the quiet, introspective alien I had shared this apartment with. I was facing a creature that had been stripped of all its control, and it was now driven by the most basic of instincts, survival. I had to act. I had to find a way to break the cycle. If I didn't, I might never escape this, alive. Suddenly, without thinking, I jerked my body sideways, using all my strength to wrench my arm free from his grip. Zorvith stumbled back in surprise, and I wasted no time. I grabbed the metal rod again, using it as a makeshift weapon. My heart pounded in my ears, and my hands were slick with sweat as I swung it at him with every ounce of strength I could muster. This time the rod made contact. But it wasn't the strike that sent Zorvith reeling back, it was the shock that registered in his eyes. For the briefest moment, he seemed to regain some semblance of clarity, a flash of recognition. But before I could take advantage of it, his body surged forward once more, faster than I could react. Zorvith wasn't just fighting me, he was fighting himself. And I had no idea how long he would be able to keep up the fight. Would he regain control, or was this the end of my existence in this strange and terrifying lockdown? The room was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battleground. My hands shook violently as I clutched the metal rod in my grip, now fully aware that each second that passed was a battle. Zorvith's eyes burned with that strange, primal hunger again, the glow of his bioluminescence pulsing in erratic patterns that mirrored the frantic thumping of my own heartbeat. I had no more time. If I couldn't find a way to stop him, I didn't know what would happen next. Zorvith lunged, moving so fast it was like he had snapped back into some terrifying, predatory version of himself. His body was a blur of motion, long limbs, sharp claws, and a forceful, almost overwhelming presence that felt as though the very air around us bent to his will. I swung the rod again, this time aiming for his head, but he dodged with the fluid grace of a creature in its prime. His speed was like nothing I had ever seen before. This was a being driven by something deep within him, a biological command that wasn't something I could reason with or appeal to. I stumbled backward, barely managing to keep my footing as he closed the distance between us. The thought crossed my mind, am I going to die here? I couldn't let it happen. I refused to let this alien take control of everything. My heart slammed in my chest as I scrambled for an escape, but the apartment was a trap. The walls were smooth, there was no hiding, and the door was sealed tight with no way of getting out. The only thing between me and the horror of whatever Zorvith had become was my dwindling courage. I gritted my teeth, gathering every ounce of strength left in me. I had to fight. I had to survive. But then, something unexpected happened. Zorvith stopped, completely still. The silence between us was deafening. My pulse raced in my ears as I watched him carefully, not daring to breathe too loudly, afraid that any movement might send him spiraling back into that maddening frenzy. His glowing eyes flickered, a flash of blue-green against the room's harsh lighting. His whole body shuddered as though he were caught between two worlds, the primal instincts of his species and the fleeting fragments of the Zorvith I had known. "Stop," he rasped, his voice low and cracked. His mandibles clicked again, but this time, it wasn't an angry sound. It was almost a plea. I stood frozen, barely daring to make a sound, unsure if I should approach or run. Could this moment of clarity be real? Or was it just a trick, a brief lapse before he descended into madness again? My grip on the rod tightened, prepared to defend myself if I needed to, but my mind was racing with questions. "Zorvith," I said, taking a slow step forward. I had no plan, no idea what to say. But I knew I couldn't just stand there waiting for him to snap again. "Please, you can fight this. You have to fight this." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his chest rose and fell with shallow, rapid breaths, his body tense with an internal struggle I could feel even from a distance. Then, in an almost imperceptible movement, he turned his head away from me as if ashamed. His body trembled. "I am sorry," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible, thick with the weight of emotion, or perhaps pain. "I cannot control it much longer." I felt my throat tighten as his words sank in. For the first time, I saw the raw vulnerability in him, the same alien who had been living quietly in my apartment, who I had thought I was beginning to understand. But now I was seeing him at his most fragile, caught in the grip of something far beyond his control. A sudden wave of empathy flooded through me. It was impossible to ignore the way Zorvith looked at me. He wasn't just an alien. He was a sentient being trapped by instincts he didn't know how to manage. The fact that he was trying to fight it even though his species was designed for this, it broke something inside me. It made me realize just how much of this wasn't his fault. "Zorvith, listen to me," I said, moving cautiously toward him. I didn't want to startle him, not now. "You don't have to hurt me. I'm not. This isn't what you want. I know you're still in there. You can fight this." I watched him closely, my breath caught in my throat. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something deeper than the biological pull of his species. It was a sign of awareness, a brief glimmer of who he was beneath all of this chaos. "Help me," he whispered, his voice raw, desperate. "Please. I need your help. I cannot." Before I could respond, the sound of the intercom system clicked on, and a voice crackled through the speakers. "Alert! Lockdown procedure has been lifted. Lockdown disengaged." The words were like a shot of adrenaline, a clear sign that the building system was now allowing communication. I turned toward the intercom, disbelief washing over me. Was this some kind of a mistake? Had someone been listening to the chaos unfolding in my apartment? I rushed over to the intercom, pressing the button with trembling hands. "Hello?" I gasped, my voice shaking. "Can you hear me? The lockdown, what's going on? Zorvith is in danger. I need help." Before I could finish my sentence, Zorvith's voice came through, louder now, tinged with an almost frantic edge. "Do not leave. You cannot leave," he rasped, his voice hoarse and desperate. "I need you." I froze, feeling the intensity of his words settle like a weight in my chest. The primal need was back, pulsing beneath the surface. He wasn't in control anymore. His instincts were ruling him, and I was the only one standing between him and total surrender to those instincts. But something shifted in me then. Maybe it was the compassion I felt for Zorvith in that moment, or the sheer realization of how little control we both had over our fates. Whatever it was, I knew one thing. This wasn't a battle I could win with force. If Zorvith was going to make it through this, we would both need to find a way to work together. "Zorvith," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. "I won't leave you. I'll stay. But you need to fight it. Please. For both of us." His eyes flickered in my direction, the storm of emotions in them slowly subsiding. His body was still tense, trembling with need and fear, but there was a glimmer of recognition, a spark of the Zorvith I had known. "I will try," he said, his voice trembling. "But it is not easy." I nodded, stepping closer to him cautiously, trying to bridge the distance between us. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if Zorvith could truly regain control. But I couldn't leave him to face this alone, not when he was trying so hard to fight the instincts he had no power over. Whatever came next, we would face it together.